the St. Francis Hotel rose proudly against the city skyline, its gleaming windows and elegant stone facade promising luxury and comfort to weary travelers. From the lobby, with its polished marble floors and golden chandeliers, nothing hinted at the darkness that lay buried within its walls. Guests came and went, smiling bellhops carried luggage, and the faint notes of a piano sometimes drifted from the lounge. Yet behind one locked door on an upper floor, the hotel kept a secret so grim that even the most seasoned staff lowered their voices when they spoke of it. Room 441. To most, it was just another room. A bed, a dresser, thick curtains to block out the city lights, and a bathroom tiled in crisp white. But those who had spent a night there told of an invisible weight pressing on their chest, of whispers that seemed to rise from the walls, of dreams that grew so real they left claw marks in the morning. And the stories did not end with uneasy sleep. Over decades, the room had earned a reputation for despair that no coat of paint or new furniture could erase. The first tragedy was whispered about by the oldest doorman, a tale handed down from his father. In the 1920s, a traveling salesman checked into the St. Francis after a long week on the road. He ordered dinner, wrote a few letters, and was found hanging from the wardrobe's sturdy bar before dawn. The newspapers wrote it off as exhaustion, the kind that gnawed at men who spent their lives away from home, but the staff muttered about the room itself. They said he had seemed cheerful when he arrived, even tipped the bellboy extra. Something had shifted between the moment he shut the door and the moment his body was discovered. After that, the hotel management tried to shrug it off. One death could happen anywhere. Hotels, after all, were crossroads, where thousands of people from all walks of life came and went. But then came another. This time, in the 1940s, it was a young woman who had checked in under a false name. She was found sprawled across the carpet, a half-empty bottle of sleeping pills beside her, a letter torn into pieces in the wastebasket. The fragments hinted at heartbreak, but there was no name, no explanation, just scribbled words of loss and a trail of ink that faded into nothing. By then, whispers grew louder. Guests who stayed in the room reported strange happenings. A man swore he heard sobbing in the corner near the window, though no one was there. Another said he woke up to the feeling of icy hands gripping his ankles, only to find the room empty and silent when he turned on the light. The hotel tried quietly closing the room, shuffling reservations so no one noticed. For years, the door stayed locked, its number gathering dust. But in time, the pressure of business forced management's hand. A nearly full hotel meant every room mattered, and after redecorating and changing the furniture, they dared to reopen it. It didn't help. By the late 1960s, the room's reputation was impossible to ignore. A businessman on a conference trip jumped from the window, leaving his neatly pressed suit and briefcase behind. His colleagues said he had been in good spirits, laughing and networking only hours earlier. The only note he left behind was a hastily scrawled message in the hotel notepad. "The walls are too loud." After that, some guests began to request the room deliberately, drawn by its legend. A few thrill-seekers claimed they wanted to spend the night just to say they had survived it, but most never stayed a second time. Those who made it through often checked out early, pale and restless, muttering vague excuses about noise, drafts, or the feeling of not being alone. One man described it best when he said, "The room doesn't let you rest, it talks to you, not with words, but with thoughts that aren't your own." The staff knew better than to laugh. Housekeepers assigned to clean the room worked quickly, often in pairs. One swore that while she was changing the bed, she heard someone humming softly in the bathroom. She dropped the sheets and ran out before checking if anyone was there. Another said she returned after vacuuming to find the mirror fogged over, though no one had used the shower. Written in the condensation, she claimed, was a single word: stay. By the 1980s, the room's reputation was cemented. Locals whispered that it wasn't just haunted but cursed, a place that fed on grief. It wasn't violent in the way of slamming doors or flying objects, but insidious. It worked slowly, seeping into the mind of anyone who dared to close the door behind them. Guests reported waves of crushing sadness, sudden bursts of anxiety, and the overwhelming urge to harm themselves. Even those who left unharmed admitted that they felt altered, as if the room had left a stain on their thoughts that they couldn't scrub away. Despite this, the St. Francis continued to operate, and room 441 remained part of its offerings. management stopped advertising it and didn't list it on booking sites, but occasionally a guest would be placed there by chance. Those guests often checked out quickly, and some returned to the front desk in the middle of the night, refusing to explain why. The staff didn't need explanations. They'd heard enough stories to fill a book. For years, the door was marked on the staff's unofficial maps with a warning, "Don't linger. Don't ask questions." But even with its reputation, the room drew people in. The strange thing about curses is that they don't just repel, they attract. People who never believed in ghosts still found themselves curious, daring each other to spend just one night, convinced they could beat whatever darkness lived there. The truth was, no one beat it. They only endured it, and most walked away shaken. And so the room waited, as it always had, for its next guest. The St. Francis Hotel bustled on, with tourists checking in, couples celebrating anniversaries, and business people rushing to meetings. But hidden on its quiet upper floor, behind an unremarkable door, the hotel's darkest secret lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The wallpaper might have been new, the bedspread freshly laundered. But the despair was older than all of it. Stitched into the walls themselves, room 441 wasn't just another hotel room. It was a place where laughter turned into sobs, where comfort twisted into dread, and where too many people had walked in alive but had not walked out the same. And if you ever find yourself at the St. Francis, with the receptionist sliding you a key and the brass numbers 441 glinting at you from the hallway, remember this story. Remember the whispers, the tragedies, the nights filled with screams muffled by thick curtains. And ask yourself, would you dare turn the key? Because some rooms don't just hold memories, they hold you. And that's where this story begins. We'll go deeper into the history, the folklore, and the chilling experiences of this story. But before we get lost in the darkness together, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze because, trust me, you're going to want to hear the rest of this terrifying tale. Dr. Elias Thorne was no ordinary hotel guest. To the public, he was known as a sharp-tongued skeptic, a writer who specialized in dismantling the ghost stories and urban legends that so many clung to. His books lined the shelves of libraries and skeptical societies, full of diagrams, explanations, and cold, rational arguments. To Elias, fear was an illusion, superstition was weakness, and belief in ghosts was a mark of ignorance. When whispers about room 441 at the St. Francis Hotel reached his ears, he saw it not as a warning, but as an opportunity. He announced his intentions with theatrical bravado. "I'll spend the night there," he told a small circle of reporters who had gathered at the hotel bar, and ILL proved that this so-called haunted room is nothing more than the product of suggestion, coincidence, and a good deal of local storytelling. The journalists scribbled eagerly, already imagining the headlines. A professional debunker taking on one of the most notorious cursed rooms in the city, it was irresistible. Elias did not come empty-handed. He carried with him a leather case packed with tools he believed would expose the truth, an electromagnetic field detector, a voice recorder, a thermal camera, and even a notebook where he jotted observations in tight, confident handwriting. Each piece of equipment was, to him, a weapon in his ongoing war against the irrational at the front desk. The clerk hesitated when Elias requested room 441. The young man's eyes flicked nervously to the manager, who gave the slightest nod as if to say, "If he insists, let him have it." The brass key slid across the counter, its number glinting in the low light. Elias smiled faintly, tucking it into his pocket, as if pocketing victory itself. He climbed the staircase instead of taking the elevator, telling himself it would give him time to absorb the atmosphere. The corridor was quiet, carpet muffling his footsteps, while sconces casting warm pools of light that left shadows lurking in between. As he approached room 441, he felt the air grow cooler, a subtle shift that tickled the back of his neck. He dismissed it as poor insulation. Still, when he turned the key and pushed open the door, a silence unlike any other greeted him. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was heavier, denser, almost deliberate, as if the air itself had been waiting for him. The hum of the city outside, so present in the rest of the hotel, seemed to vanish the moment he crossed the threshold. His footsteps echoed faintly as he set down his case, though the carpet should have absorbed the sound. He clicked on the lamp by the bed. The bulb flickered once before settling into a weak glow. Elias chuckled under his breath. Cheap wiring, he muttered, jotting it down. He began his investigation methodically. He placed the EMF detector on the desk, its tiny green light blinking steadily. He walked the perimeter of the room, running his hand along the wallpaper, knocking lightly on the walls to check for hidden cavities. He set the thermal camera on the dresser, angled toward the bed. Each step he took was measured, rational, deliberate. But beneath the steady rhythm of his movements, the silence pressed tighter. As he worked, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the room was watching him. He laughed at the thought. It was absurd. Rooms didn't watch. Still, when he looked up from his notes, his eyes lingered on the mirror above the dresser. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move across it, though he was standing perfectly still. He blinked, leaned closer, and found nothing but his own reflection staring back, slightly distorted by age-worn glass. Hours passed. He spoke into his recorder, narrating each observation, temperature steady, no unusual readings, lighting inconsistent, likely due to faulty wiring. No audible disturbances beyond the faint creak of the building's frame. His voice was firm, but beneath it was a tension he refused to acknowledge. Around midnight, he decided to perform what he called a control test. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he switched off the lamp, letting the room sink into near total darkness. Only the small blinking lights of his equipment offered faint comfort. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath, waiting for the silence to be broken by something explainable. It was then that he heard it. Not loud, not sudden, a whisper, soft and breathy, rising from the corner of the room. At first, it was so faint he thought it was the blood rushing in his ears. But then it grew clearer, forming something that resembled a word. Elias snapped his eyes open and switched on the recorder, his hand trembling only slightly. He forced a laugh. "Audio interference," he said aloud, though his throat was dry. He checked the corner where the sound had come from. The space was empty, shadows spilling across the carpet. The EMF detector began to beep, slow at first, then faster, its light shifting from green to yellow. Elias leaned over it, scanning the room with his thermal camera. The screen showed a faint cold spot near the wardrobe, a pocket of air at least 15 degrees lower than the rest of the room. He frowned, adjusting the lens. Poor insulation, he told himself again, though even he knew that didn't explain the shape that appeared next a vague outline. Not quite human, but unmistakably present. His rational mind clawed for explanations, drafts, reflections, equipment malfunction. Yet with each second, the silence pressed harder, until his own heartbeat sounded deafening in his ears. He tried to shake it off, but the mirror on the wall drew his eyes again. This time, he didn't see just a distortion. He saw a movement, something shifting behind his reflection, pale and deliberate, as if someone else were standing just over his shoulder. He spun around. Nothing. Elias exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the dresser to steady himself. "Psychosomatic," he muttered, writing the word in his notebook, though his hand shook so badly the letters slanted. He set down the pen and tried to gather himself. "I don't scare easily. I don't." The whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. "Stay." The lamp flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness before buzzing back to life. Elias' carefully constructed wall of skepticism cracked for the first time. He backed toward the bed, recorder still running, his voice trembling as he said, "Noted strong auditory hallucination, possible external interference." But deep down, even he knew he was no longer in control of the experiment. The room had begun its own. And as the minutes ticked past midnight, Dr. Elias Thorne, the man who laughed at legends, was starting to realize that some places don't care, whether you believe in them or not. They only care that you've walked through their door. Dr. Elias Thorne had entered room 441 with the arrogance of a man who believed no shadow could unsettle him. No whisper could shake his convictions. Yet, as the night deepened, the cracks in his skepticism widened. What had begun as isolated oddities, a flicker of a lamp, the hum of silence that seemed to deliberate slowly built into something far more oppressive. It started with whispers. At first, Elias thought it was his imagination, or perhaps the muffled noise of late-night guests in the rooms nearby. But as he pressed his ear against the wall, he realized the sound didn't come from outside. It came from within. The voices were faint, weaving through the plaster and wood-like air through a flute. Not words, not sentences, but a droning hum, like countless people murmuring their regrets at once. The cadence shifted, sometimes slow, sometimes rushing, sometimes overlapping so chaotically it was unbearable. Elias sat with his recorder pressed close, speaking into it as he always did when documenting anomalies. Time 2:30 a.m. Noted auditory hallucinations resembling multiple voices overlapping. Testing equipment, he pressed the record button, holding the device steady. Yet, when he played it back, silence greeted him, not even static. His voice was absent too. The machine hadn't captured a single sound. He tested again, this time speaking louder, recording St. Francis' room. Auditory disturbances. When he replayed it, the tape hissed for half a second and then cut off. The recorder was blank, as though time itself had been erased in those moments. For the first time, Elias felt the sharp sting of unease run through him. He replaced the batteries, adjusted the settings, even tested it on his own voice outside the door. It worked perfectly everywhere else. Only inside the room did it fail. The whispers returned, louder now, scraping against his composure. They didn't stop when he tried to drown them out with rational explanations. Instead, they grew persistent, curling around his thoughts, pressing down on him until he felt a weight in his chest. By 3 a.m., Elias noticed something he couldn't ignore. His body felt heavy, sluggish, as though every movement was wrapped in chains. He sat at the desk, staring at the wood grain, and for the first time in years he felt despaired, a rational sadness. But something raw and primal, a sense of futility so strong it gripped his very bones. He told himself it was exhaustion. But exhaustion didn't explain the images that flashed through his mind. Without warning, vivid scenes unfolded in his head, people throwing themselves from the high windows of the hotel, their faces twisted in anguish. He could hear the thud of bodies hitting the street, feel the gust of air rushing past as if he too were falling. He jerked upright, drenched in sweat. Dreams, he muttered. Hypnagogic hallucinations. Normal. But he hadn't been asleep. His eyes had never closed. Shaken, Elias tried to ground himself. He opened his notebook, forcing his hand to write observations, but the pen refused to obey. Instead of his neat, angled script, jagged scribbles filled the page, words that weren't his own. Jump, stay, sorrow. He stared at the ink, trembling. The pen slipped from his hand. Pacing the room, he fought for control. He recited facts, dates, names of philosophers, anything to remind himself of the world beyond this cursed space. But the whispers only swelled, feeding on his resistance. Now they layered into something more distinct. Some carried the tone of weeping, others of pleading, and one voice low, insistent, cut through them all. Elias turned toward the wardrobe, the source of the cold spot earlier, and for the briefest moment, he swore the wood grain shifted, shapes emerged, not patterns, but faces hollow-eyed, mouths wide in silent screams. He blinked, and the grain returned, yet the chill in the room deepened, wrapping him in frost. At 4, he could no longer fight his fatigue. He lay on the bed, intending only to rest his eyes. But sleep came hard and fast, dragging him into nightmares so vivid they eclipsed reality. He stood in the same room, though the wallpaper peeled and the carpet was soaked with something dark. A woman sat in the corner, her back bent, her hair hanging in wet strands across her face. She didn't move. The whispers surrounded him still, but now they were louder, circling him like a storm. He tried to approach her, but his legs felt like stone. The woman raised her head slowly, and where her eyes should have been, there were only voids. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, except this time it wasn't in his head. It was out loud, echoing with the weight of every lost soul who had ever stepped foot in the cursed room. He woke with a strangled cry, clutching his chest, certain for a moment that someone was sitting at the edge of the bed. The sheets were rumpled, indented, as though another body had lain there beside him. He leaped to his feet, heart hammering, his skepticism eroding by the second. His equipment lay scattered on the desk. The EMF detector blinked erratically, shifting from green to red in wild bursts. The thermal camera displayed static, though he hadn't touched it. His recorder, when checked again, contained only a faint hiss, and beneath it, just audible if he pressed it to his ear, was a whisper, a single word, repeated over and over. "Stay, stay, stay." Elias slammed it down, refusing to listen further. He felt the pull of despair stronger than before, the suggestion curling inside his mind. The urge to open the window, to feel the night air rush against his skin, became disturbingly tempting. He shook his head violently, gripping the desk until his knuckles whitened. "No," he hissed. "I control this, not the other way around." But even as he said it, the room pulsed with a life of its own. The whispers merged into a chorus, a symphony of regret and torment that filled every inch of space. They no longer stayed within the walls, they poured into the air, pressing against his skin, vibrating in his bones. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it made no difference. The sound came from within, burrowed deep inside his head. Tears burned his eyes, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd wept. His body shook with the weight of despair that wasn't his own. A grief carried across decades and imprinted into the very structure of the room. As dawn crept through the blinds, Elias sat hunched in the chair, eyes bloodshot, face pale. The whispers had quieted, but not vanished. They lingered, faint, just beneath the hum of the waking city. He had survived the first night, but survival felt hollow. The skeptic who had laughed at legends now faced a truth he couldn't measure, couldn't record, couldn't explain. And though he wouldn't admit it aloud, he knew the room had only just begun. Elias had barely managed to survive the second night, his nerves shredded and his mind fraying under the constant weight of whispers that would not leave him. By the third evening, he had stopped trying to write notes or adjust his equipment. His hands shook too much, and every time he lifted the recorder, the faint word "stay" echoed back at him in tones he could no longer deny. He sat in the chair by the desk, staring at the wardrobe as if expecting something to crawl out of it. Exhaustion slowly pulling him toward a restless sleep. At some point in the small hours of the morning, he awoke to a sound unlike the others. Not whispers, not the creaking of the old wood, but a slow, dragging breath. It wasn't his own, and it wasn't outside. It filled the room, deliberate and heavy, as though another set of lungs shared the space with him. He froze, his heart thudding so loudly that he thought it might drown out the sound. But then he saw Itha's antique mirror mounted on the wall opposite his bed. Its surface was fogged, as though someone had exhaled directly onto the glass. Elias blinked hard, convinced it was a trick of his tired eyes, but the fog remained, spreading across the pane until the entire surface was clouded. And then, through the mist, a face began to form. It was not his reflection. A woman's face, pale and drawn, emerged slowly, as if carving itself out of the condensation. Her features were sharp but sunken, her lips thin and colorless, her cheeks hollow with despair. The sockets of her eyes seemed impossibly dark, pools of shadow that stared directly into him. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. The weight of her gaze held him pinned, a paralysis not of the body, but of the soul. Her expression was not cruel, it was worse. It was sorrowful, the kind of sorrow that dragged you down into its depth, making you believe escape was impossible. She looked like someone begging him to join her, to understand her grief by sharing it. The longer Elias stared, the more the room around him faded. The bed, the desk, the wardrobe all seemed to dissolve until only the mirror and that mournful face remained. He whispered aloud, though his throat was dry, "Who are you?" The fog on the mirror shifted, as if stirred by her breath, and then her lips moved. He couldn't hear words, but he knew she was speaking. The whispers returned, rising like a tide around him, and this time they seemed to translate her silence. A chorus filled his head, merging into one command: "Let go, let go, let go." Elias stumbled to his feet, shaking his head violently. He backed away from the mirror, but the woman's face grew sharper, clearer, as though the distance between them no longer mattered. He threw the curtains open, hoping that the dawn would bring some sanity, but the light barely penetrated the gloom. Instead, he caught his reflection in the glass of the window, and his reflection wasn't his own, it was her. He staggered back, knocking over the chair, his chest tightening with panic. He spun toward the mirror again. Now the woman's hand was pressed against the inside of the glass, her fingers long and skeletal, the nails cracked and splintered. Slowly, achingly slowly, she reached forward, as though the glass itself was thinning into air. Her palm pressed out toward him, inviting him to take it. When Elias finally stumbled out of the St. Francis hotel room, he did not feel triumphant. There was no rush of relief, no clean severing of ties. He had escaped with his body intact, but something inside him had been claimed by the darkness that clung to those walls. The man who had checked in the bold skeptic with notebooks and cameras and an eagerness to dismantle superstition was not the same man who staggered into the morning light. His hand still bled from the dresser he had punched, His eyes were sunken from a night without rest, and worst of all, his mind carried echoes of the whispers that had promised to never leave him. He did not return for his equipment. His recorders, his cameras, the files neatly stacked in his suitcase, all of it, remained inside the cursed room. To go back, even for a moment, felt unthinkable. He checked out of the hotel without explanation, his voice hoarse as he gave his name at the front desk. The clerk offered a polite smile, unaware that the guest standing before him was fleeing for his sanity. Elias signed the form with a trembling hand and walked out into the daylight, swearing never to return. But absence does not mean escape. In the weeks that followed, he tried to bury the experience under logic. He told himself it had been exhaustion, faulty wiring, sleep deprivation. The suggestive power of an old story repeating itself in his mind. But none of those explanations survived the long nights that followed, when his apartment echoed with faint murmurs that seemed to seep from the walls, when his mirrors clouded without reason, and when his dreams brought him back again and again to that sorrowful face pressing out from the glass. He had not left the room. He had carried it with him. For months, he refused to write. His publisher pressed him for the manuscript that was supposed to dismantle the legend of the St. Francis hotel room. Instead, Elias drank too much coffee, paced his study, and filled notebooks with half-mad scribbles, fragments of whispers, sketches of the woman's face, repeated phrases that made no sense to anyone but him. Let go, stay, join. The rational debunker who had spent his career laughing at ghost stories now found himself terrified by the simplest things: a quiet apartment, a darkened hallway, the sound of his own breath fogging a bathroom mirror. Eventually, he broke. He sat at his desk one night, staring at the stack of empty paper, and realized that he could not debunk the legend. The story had won. It demanded to be written, not as fiction, not as mockery, but as testimony. His book took shape not as an expose, but as a confession. He chronicled every detail of his stay the oppressive silence that fell the moment he stepped inside. The whispers that clawed at the edges of his thoughts, the face in the mirror that had nearly claimed his soul. He wrote as though purging poison from his veins. But even as he put words to paper, he knew that the poison could not truly be expelled. When the book was finally published, it shocked both his fans and his critics. Here was the great skeptic, the man who had made a career of dismantling ghost stories, now standing before the world as a witness to one of the most chilling hauntings ever recorded. Reviewers dismissed it as sensationalism, claiming Elias had betrayed his principles for profit. But those who read the book carefully noticed something unsettling. His words carried a weight that could not be faked. He did not write like a man cashing in on a myth. He wrote like a man confessing to a wound that had never healed. The fallout from the book was immediate. The St. Francis Hotel, already plagued by rumors, was forced to seal the room again. Guests had begun requesting it for thrill-seeking reasons, but after Elias's account circulated, demand shifted from curiosity to avoidance. The management plastered over the door, officially citing renovations, but staff whispered the truth. The room was not fit for human habitation. Some employees even claimed that, late at night, they could still hear muffled cries drifting from behind the wall, as though the voices Elias described were real and waiting for another listener. Elias himself did not escape the consequences. Friends noticed he was thinner, paler, his once confident manner replaced with a quiet, distracted air. He spoke less and less in interviews, often staring off as if hearing something no one else could. His lectures became erratic, peppered with long silences. Students and journalists who pressed him for details often left unsettled, not by what he said, but by what seemed to linger unspoken in his eyes. He was no longer debunking the supernatural, he was living with it. The book became his last significant work. He published nothing else, though his journals discovered after his death suggest he continued to battle the echoes of the St. Francis hotel room for the rest of his life. Pages scrawled with desperate pleas, drawings of the mirror, and passages written in a trembling hand made it clear that he never truly escaped. Whether the whispers were real or madness consuming him hardly mattered. To Elias, there was no difference. The room had imprinted itself on his soul, dragging its despair into every space he occupied. Today, the St. Francis hotel room remains sealed. Tourists whisper about it, pointing to the floor where it once stood. Some claim the wallpaper on the adjoining hallway ripples, as though hiding something beneath. Others insist they've caught a faint reflection in windows nearby, a pale woman watching from nowhere. but no guest has been allowed inside for years. The management insists it is closed for preservation, but locals know the truth. It's a wound in the hotel's history that cannot be healed, only contained. And yet, the story survives, not as rumor, but as testimony. Elise's book continues to circulate, warning readers that some places are not legends, but traps. It reminds us that walls can absorb despair, that mirrors can reflect more than our faces, and that sometimes the act of staying in a room is not a choice, but a surrender. So when people ask if the St. Francis Hotel room still exists, the answer is yes, but it should not. It remains behind its sealed door, waiting with infinite patience, its whispers ready to coil around the mind of anyone foolish enough to return. The curse is not gone. It is merely paused, holding its breath until the moment it can draw in another life. And maybe that's why stories like this continue to matter. They are not just entertainment, not just thrill-seeking legends to be laughed off. They are warnings. Some doors are better left closed, some mirrors better left uncovered, and some whispers better left unanswered. If you want more stories that crawl under your skin and stay there, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to Belmoze. Because legends are one thing, but when a skeptic like Elias confirms them with his own life, you start to wonder how many other places out there aren't just stories, but traps waiting for us to walk inside.